This is the Parents in Sport podcast. Amazing guests, honest conversations, topics that matter.
Welcome to season 5 of the Parents in Sport podcast. I am your host, Gordon MacLelland. I'm delighted to be joined today by former professional cricketer and mindset and performance coach, Lewis Hatchett. Lewis, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me, mate. Loving to be here.
Now, today we're going to talk about perfectionism and the positives and perils of perfectionism, what that potentially means for our young people, what that means for us as sports parents. But before we dig into that topic, Lewis, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so right now I'm a mindset mental performance coach. I'm a former professional cricketer. I'm also the host of the Raising Your Game podcast and the creator of the Mind Strong Sport app. It's a lot going on there. But yeah, my background was in professional sport. I have a pretty unique story how I got into it. My journey post-career, which ended when I was 26 through injury, led me down some very different roads to begin with. But then my interest in mindset, mental performance, the psychological side of sport really ignited when I actually started my own podcast, Raising Your Game, and then was speaking to athletes. And then I started my master's in performance psychology at Bangor University. And my interest just grew. And then the creation of the Mind Strong Sport app, which is a tool that we use to help develop mental skills, mindset in athletes using things like meditations, exercises, breathing, even a little bit of yoga here and there, that we can really start to work on this mental side of the game for athletes. And yeah, it's taken me around the world at the moment, and I absolutely love it. It's something I didn't forecast when I was going into, say, professional sport as a 15-year-old kid wanting to become a professional cricketer. I didn't think this is where I'd be, but I think it's actually a path that I'm kind of, I think, meant to be on now. I think I'm really coming to terms with this is actually something I'm meant to be doing, and I'm so well lended to this. I think there's so many different things that I've done alongside cricket that I've picked up skill-wise that are now coming together, and it's just, yeah, I'm just really enjoying what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, and you can see that you're doing a fantastic job. Always a good listen. Lewis's podcast, for those of you that like listening to stuff, certainly really enlightening. And actually, one of the recent episodes was, I guess, part of the motivation for getting back in touch with Lewis and discussing today's topic. So I want to talk about perfectionism. You're probably brilliantly versed to talk about this as a recovering perfectionist, as you have described yourself. What do you see as some of the I guess the pros and cons of perfectionism?
Well, I actually think perfectionism is quite misunderstood. So a lot of people think of it depends how people see it, right? A lot of people give it a negative connotation. Oh, I'm such a perfectionist. I'm always need to be a perfectionist. And look, I've had people on my podcast. I've had some of the godfathers of perfectionism. Someone's like Dr. Gordon MacLelland come on the show, who pretty much wrote some of the early definitions and found some of the early models of perfectionism. And then, like you said, recently had Patrick Goodrow on the podcast, who created this new model of excellencism, which I'm sure we'll get into. But my interest into it initially, if I start there, just came from me starting my academic reading through my master's. And I had gone on to a module around personality and then into perfectionism. And I just read it and I felt like I was reading an autobiography of myself, really. I was like, this is everything I've experienced, almost to the point where when I did one of my assessments, I actually did it on myself. And I just completely did a full assessment of myself in the lens of perfectionism, and looking back at some of my old experiences, both growing up and then into the professional arena. And like I mentioned, people see perfectionism and they see it as this, oh, I'm such a perfectionist. And they think of it almost through like an OCD lens, where I need to have everything in place and everything needs to be ideal. But at the end of the day, perfectionism is a beautiful double-edged sword. But there's this paradox that exists within perfectionism. And on one side, you have what are now known as perfectionistic strivings. So these are all like the positive sides of perfectionism, which people who are perfectionists are usually, they have high standards. So you want them in the team because you want them in your environments because they have those high standards. They're driven, they're motivated, sometimes creative. And those are really positive attributes for people to have. However, there are perfectionistic concerns, the sort of maladaptive behaviors of it, which are you have concerns over mistakes, you doubt your actions, you need to have everything organized, you need everything to be perfect and ideal in order to take that first step before you do something. You just are worried about that criticism, maybe fearing failure a little bit. And that is a real drawback, and it creates things like procrastination. Now, anyone in, say, like the business world would really understand this. Like, I'm not going to send that email until it's absolutely written perfectly, or I'm not going to start that podcast until I've got all the best equipment. And geez, I've fallen down that road before. But in sport, it may be that I'm not going to play this game, or I'm not going to put myself forward for this game because I just don't feel ready yet. I don't feel like I'm at that level. Or I'm worried that if I perform in this game, I'm not going to perform at the standard in which I'm setting myself. And then we can start to go into where this all comes from. So what are the causes of perfectionism in an individual? And it is various different ways in which it shows up and how it affects an individual. But really, it stems from three areas of self-orientated perfectionism, socially prescribed perfectionism, and then there's a third called other orientated perfectionism, which is an area that I am interested in for my current research that I'm doing.
Fantastic. So I guess what I'm hearing is we don't want to place a label on perfectionism as being good or bad. So we're trying to raise our self-awareness, particularly as sports parents. Are we seeing it in our young people? Is it being helpful, or is it potentially hindering performance? What are some of the signs that we would maybe see as parents if our children perhaps are perfectionists? What could we expect to see in the real world almost?
I think if you hear someone say that's not good enough or that wasn't good enough, that's probably a telltale sign. I think I have a couple of athletes that I work with that are definitely perfectionists, and I see it more and more that the standards in which they reach, there is never something that they're really happy with of obtaining. They can obtain a really high level of elite performance, and yet they still feel it's not good enough. There's still something else to get. There's always something missing. Now, look, there is an element of that where you go, okay, that's a good thing to have. You want to constantly improve. But when it tips over the line that you are never satisfied with a good day, a good performance, that's where we start to go, okay, this is an issue here. This is something that is a concern. And like I mentioned, where that comes from, you have this self-orientated perfectionism. That's your own drive to be perfectionistic. These are your own high standards that you're setting yourself. So self-orientated is coming from within. Where that comes from is a range of different things. It can come from parents. There's a lot of like parental expectations in which that can come from. It can come from your own expectations. It can come from society's expectations. And that's where we look at socially prescribed perfectionism. If you look at the world we live in right now, the Instagram effect, the social media effect, the TikTok effect of having to have such high standards, maybe on self-presentation, on self-image, that's a big one, that it's a pressure to be perfectionistic, to have that high standard at all times. And therefore, placing that perfectionism on someone else means that they go, okay, well, if I don't meet that standard, then is it any good? And why even bother if I can't reach that standard, or I'm no good, or I'm not good enough if I don't reach that standard? And it's unrealistic sometimes, especially in that social media world. We know it's not the real world. We know it's not. People are portraying their highlight reels, their ultimately glamorized best self, sometimes even AI generated, filtered selves. And you're creating a non-realistic standard for people to achieve. And that's exactly what happens in perfectionism, is you create a unrealistic high expectation of yourself at certain times. And then the last one being other orientated perfectionism, which is found in leaders, coaches, that is your want for someone else to be perfectionistic. I even think of this in, say, relationship terms, where people have, I spoke to Dr. Andy Hill from York University, where we spoke about the ick culture that's happening in relationships, where people find these imperfections in people, and that turns them off in the relationship. But that is essentially other orientate perfectionism. It is my want for you to be a certain standard. And we see that in coaches and in parents, and you're placing a standard onto them. And if someone is already perfectionistic, that could start to rear up that internal perfectionism themselves, that self-orientate perfectionism. My standards are only increasing because I'm feeling this pressure coming on from people outside.
Yeah, I'm now beginning to slightly doubt my own perceptions of the world, and now thinking about my own sports parenting here, particularly with my second child, sometimes about, is that drive that I want to see her potentially reach a standard, is that coming from me? And actually, maybe that's hitting a conflict point at the moment, because she probably wants to do that herself anyway. And actually, I'm probably adding a negative implication to something that, if I just let it run its course and support, probably be a, it might work out for me. But it certainly gets us thinking. I know I'm very conscious at the moment, and I spend time in sessions talking to parents about this and young people about the social media world and what they're actually seeing, and the realities of a sporting journey, and the fact we know that it's going to be littered with ups and downs. We know it's probably never really ever going to be perfect. There are some good things, though. I'm always careful, and I know you are as well, about labeling things and saying things are good and bad. There can be some healthy comparison, though, can't there, when we're talking about supporting our children, raising young people, and I'm thinking about things like maybe where young people are watching other performers and perhaps learning from them, or taking ideas of things that they use. And a couple of the guys going off to the Olympics this year, I was talking to them about this just in general, and they were saying, oh yeah, no, I watch that Olympic medalist, and I've nicked some of the bits out of her routine and done stuff like that. So they see that as healthy. It's not degrading their own ability. They're seeing it as a way of aiding performance. I think we've got to help young people with all of that comparison piece.
Yeah, I don't think, like I said, there's nothing wrong with having high standards. There's nothing wrong with having high standards as an athlete. You shouldn't be ashamed of that. You should actually be proud of that. That's ultimately what sets you apart, right? That's what sets you apart from Joe Blogs on the street, that you are going down that road. And there needs to be a price you sort of pay in that sense. Like, if you want to have these, and this is me talking as an athlete now that has gone down that road, there is always a price paid when you are choosing to go down a road that no one else is going down. And you just have to be aware of what the costs are to that. And so if I'm choosing to go down this road, then there are some sacrifices that are probably going to need to be made. And we've had a conversation pre-recording about that some people will try to protect people from those costs. But in protecting people from those costs, you probably rip them of the high performance that they actually strive for in the first place. So you could argue, is that a good or bad thing? You're protecting them from these maladaptive behaviors, the negative impacts, the perils of what high performance can bring. But are you ripping them away from the one thing they did want to achieve in the very first place, which is the motivation to be a high performer, to be at that level, to be doing these great things? So there's nothing wrong with going after those. It's just being able to protect it. And that's why I really enjoyed my episode with Patrick Goudreau about his new model of excellencism, which ultimately is about trying to keep all of these perfectionistic strivings, the good things, and trying to negate and maybe remove as many of the concerns and the negatives as we can.
Yeah, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into that conversation, because it was a brilliant conversation, and I'd never heard the use of the word excellencism. I mean, heaven help me when I was trying to spell it or type it into Google to find out a little bit more. I think Google was struggling with it, but it's a fascinating concept, and I think it does give us a really nice framework of excellencism, perfectionism, similarities, differences, but they're very subtle differences, aren't they? Can you do your best to, I guess, dilute your 2-hour conversation with Patrick into just summarize what you were discussing and talking about?
Yeah, I think I just have to do this quite often. So I try to simplify it very quickly by just saying perfectionism has these incredibly high standards, sometimes unrealistic. And excellencism, if you, again, I encourage people to go and listen to that episode. It is 2 hours long, but I've had multiple messages come from it, not only from myself, but from parents, and going, wow, this is a much better model or much better approach to having high standards within my child, myself, whatever it may be. And not only that, Patrick's got one of the greatest French Canadian accents you can hope to have, and he's so passionate about it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, what he talks about is that we are trying to remove some of these negative concerns from perfectionism and trying to keep some of the good things, because they are good. They in themselves are inherently good. So why not change essentially the perspective that you have in it? Let's not shoot for perfection. Let's shoot for excellence. And it actually was similar to something I'd had with Dr. Gordon Flett, right? So Dr. Gordon Flett spoke about being a rigid perfectionist and an adaptable perfectionist. And essentially a rigid perfectionist being someone who, and I had felt this as an example, where let's say in your training program, you've got to go for a run. You say, I need to improve my cardio, and I've set a run out for tonight. But suddenly it starts thunderstorming outside. It's hailing. It's just horrendous. A rigid perfectionist will go out in that rain. The drive to achieve that scheduled training slot and that session is far greater than the perils of going out in the rain and being dumped on with all that sleet and hail. They wouldn't even consider maybe going into the gym and doing it on a treadmill, because it's not what the standard that they set out for themselves. Now, I have done that. I have been the person that, and I still struggle with it today, where if I've got a gym session locked in, like, I will not go to bed until I know I've achieved it or done something. And sometimes I've gone to the gym at 1 a.m. and just gone to achieve it. It's just, I've been so rigid. But he presented this idea of being an adaptable perfectionist, really loosening the reins of that thinking and that perspective, and saying, okay, but if you're rigid as a perfectionist, that kind of sits in only one silo of conditions. You're only really going to perform in one set of conditions. But if you can be adaptable, that's a far better athlete to get. If you were to show an athlete 2 options, do you want to be perfect or adaptable? But you were to say being perfect, that might be enticing, but it's only going to work in certain conditions, in certain environments at the right time. But if you're adaptable, you can actually turn your high standards and use it as your advantage, and then use it when you need to. And that's kind of similar. It's not the same, but what Patrick is talking about in excellencism is trying to keep those high standards, but kind of dropping them a little bit and just lowering, going, what is excellent? What is excellence today? Right. So excellence today in, say, my sport of cricket may not be getting 100, right? An unrealistic expectation of going to every game and getting 100. An excellent game today could be just the approach you have in the sport, the approach you have, the energy you need to put into your performance. It could be a really gritty 30 that you have to get through because the pitch is not going to get you 100. Right now, the round of championship cricket that's being played, there's a lot of scores below 150, 200 at the moment. It's a round of cricket where the pitches are doing a little bit. It's very challenging for the batters. So if you were in that changing room right now, a coach would ideally be saying, look, the expectation here may not be to get 100. You're motivated to get 100. You will want to get 100. But if you set your expectations or your performance outcomes that are acceptable to you being 100, you will only feel disappointed if you go and get like a gritty 30, what the team needs, because you've not met that expectation that you've set for yourself. You've set an unrealistic expectation. You've not achieved it. And so you have felt you're not good enough, even though you've done something that's positive for the team. Do you kind of see what I'm saying? Is that you're not setting a standard based on what you would like to achieve that you think is actually what is needed right in front of you. And excellence can be in many different forms, right? So it's almost unlimited, because excellence can just be in the approach you need to be. It can be the character that you have, as well as the performance that you put in, which can be adaptable, which can change depending on what's in front of you. It's not rigid, and it allows you to to perform in many different environments.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it would be interesting to look at the expectations on that pitch for the semi-final of the T20 as well, where I think actually they'd be lucky if they get to 10 in the Afghanistan-South Africa game, looking at how the
Right.
pitch was playing. That was tough. If they'd all got 10, it's probably a winning score almost.
Yeah, well, I spoke to you before. I was in New York, and I got to go and watch the South Africa Bangladesh game. And just as a cricket fan, it was amazing. But the pitch itself was really challenging, and a great game. The pitch leveled the game, but you sit there and you go, no one was going to score like a fastest ball 100 that day. So if any of those players went out and said, okay, well, I need to score 50 or 100 in order for today to be a good day, well, it's an unrealistic expectation that if they don't meet it, even if they've created some form of match-winning performance of getting a 20 runnable 20 that puts their team over the line because that's what the game did, you'd still feel not enough because you just didn't achieve that expectation you set out for yourself. So the idea is to go out there and lower your expectations, but kind of still aim up. It's what a combination of what Mo Gaudat would talk about of lowering your expectations of life, but also someone like Jordan Peterson who would say lower your expectations, but still aim up. Right. There's nothing wrong with lowering your expectations as long as you're still aiming up and it's an achievable step that you can take. But sometimes we, as perfectionists, definitely, we set such high expectations of ourselves that step in order to get towards it can be so daunting and such a risk, especially if we don't achieve that performance. But not only that, it's sometimes even too big a step that we don't even want to take that step because it's like, well, what if I fail going after that? What if I don't achieve it? And if I don't achieve it, then what does that say about me? And it is really about expectations and managing those.
Yeah, I want to dig a little bit deeper into that, this idea of how do we help our young people set the right level of expectation. And I think there will be a lot of sports parents who are listening to this because I can relate on a personal level with my own children to some of the bits that you are talking about there. That is there almost at times a fear of failure so that you don't actually put yourself in a position to actually do what you're probably capable of doing. So it becomes a self-preservation thing as opposed to actually aiming high. So you end up almost not even attempting to do it or wanting to do it unless all conditions are absolutely in your favor. How are we helping young people and parents with this? I mean, there's not obviously a silver bullet. That's another good read, by the way. Those of you listening, No Silver Bullet by Steve Hearson is a really good book talking about how complex the world actually is. But what would we be thinking about, Lewis, in terms of those two pieces?
In terms of how we help parents and athletes.
And just talk about how we set the right level of expectations perhaps on a given day, but also how we help young people not fear that bit of failure, almost not fall into that trap of procrastination, which I think we can all do at times.
Yeah, I think one thing is setting your expectation of what failure really means and having a good reframe of what failure actually is. Now, you talk about that there's so many people, and I talk about this, and even my research is going into fear of failure and its impact on perfectionistic athletes. But I think saying failure is a good thing can sometimes be easier to say than and much harder to do. Right? You hear it all the time. We got to fail. The amount of athletes that failed, and there was a great speech by Roger Federer recently at Dartmouth University, which went viral, and it's so true. It is so true. But I think the way in which and I look at this from my lens of my experience, my parents, like no parent out there, had a manual of how to manage their child, right? Especially one in sport. But my parents were never really pushy in performance. They knew I needed to perform, but they just kind of kept putting me in front of situations and kept saying, this is the next step you do. What's the next step? How are you getting there? And I was kind of left to figure out how I was going to get to where I wanted to get to. Now, for me, I knew, for example, in cricket, I needed to take a certain amount of wickets. I need to have a certain average. I need to have good stats in which I could show coaches and be like, look, I'm good enough. Like, I'm doing that. And then that broke down sort of what I needed to achieve. I needed to go and to do the training to get myself those skills that would allow me to achieve that. But my parents never, when I went to a game, said, you need to take 5 wickets, right? You've got to take 5 wickets here. It would be based around, and there were very rarely conversations. It would be about, right, try to be consistent, like do your best, have good energy, things like that. And they weren't massive conversations. My parents were quite hands off, which was, again, a real positive. I spoke to Roger Black on the podcast, and he said his parents were really standoffish in the sense. And my dad would drop me at games and kind of be like, right, go figure it out yourself, and then we'll talk about it later. But we rarely did. And I think there is sometimes over management then that can happen from parents that do that, where they will suddenly go, right, how are you going to perform? Like, you've got to get 100 today. And if you get 100, or actually, if there is a good performance, if an athlete does have a good performance, and let's say, again, in the cricket terms, they get 100, or in football, they might get a hat trick or whatever it might score a bunch of goals. They praise that performance, that outcome so much that it sets a future expectation that a perfectionistic athlete may start to think, I need to achieve that. I had this even in a business context in one of my corporate clients, where I had a lad hit his targets after 1 week, and then he set the expectation that every week following that would either need to set and hit that target or exceed it. But in the environment that he's in the world that he works in, that is just such an unrealistic expectation, because no one in the history of that business has ever done that. So after he had a performance, he set a new expectation of it continuously needing to be like that, rather than saying, okay, well, this is just a good performance out of many. And when it comes to failure, I think managing that fear of failure comes from a zoomed out lens of knowing what is it that you're kind of willing to accept in a, say, season, in a career, in terms of failure. Now, I worked with a high school quarterback in America, and he had training sessions where he would blow up. And I was like, why are you blowing up? He said, because I'm not completing passes. So what's your expectation? When did you start blowing up? He said, as soon as I missed my first pass, I blew up and I just couldn't, that was it. I said, so hold on, anything below 100% completion rate, you are not willing to accept. And he kind of nodded. And so I jumped on Google and I was like, Tom Brady, pass completion rate. And I think Tom Brady's is 69%, maybe 70%, the greatest of all time. Right. And Patrick Mahomes will probably be in that one as well. So I said to him, right, look at this. You're not willing to accept a percentage 30% higher than the best quarterback of all time. If you went into training and you hit 50%, that's still bloody good for someone who is 15, 16 years old. Like, what are we talking about here? So you have to zoom out that lens for them and go, you're setting such an unrealistic expectation. And also, in that process, you're not learning anything about you. If you do flawless performances over and over again, if you genuinely are perfect and you create perfect performances over and over and over again, what the hell do you learn? You only learn what a perfect performance looks like. But then when days turn up, and we know sport, because it's beautiful in this way that it's idiosyncratic and the conditions are against you, you feel a little bit tight and sore. It's about those athletes who can deal with what's in front of them, how they reset their expectations of that day. They reset their standards for that day to get some form of excellent performance, not perfect, but excellent performance of what that day requires. And then they're able to perform consistently. That's the best performers I've ever seen that consistently can do that. But if you shoot for perfection based off a great performance previously, or you're a parent that said, well, that was a great performance, let's do it again, without the realistic zoomed out perspective of going, that was just one good performance in maybe a season where we do that 2 or 3 more times, and that's still an incredible season. So the performances that you get, especially when they're positive, can really reset those expectations from the athlete and the parent. And I think overall, what I'm trying to get at is it's zooming out and going, what is it that I'm potentially willing to accept? And I can get onto later about the minimal viable performances as to something that people can strategically set, something I found that works really well for both athletes, and maybe in this context would be a parent to understand what that actually is.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, gosh, so much to unpick there. How on earth do we summarize all the stuff that Lewis has discussed there? Because there's some absolute gold in amongst it. One of a few things that I can certainly connect with Lewis and in our work with parents is I'm a bit like you. Obviously it's the reframing of failure and disappointment becomes really important in talking to our kids. But I'm like you as well, though. I mean, you hear a lot of, oh, you've got to embrace failure. I mean, whoever wants to embrace failure? I mean, it's a horrible side. I don't want to embrace failure, thanks. It's the last thing I want you to say it, but actually that's what we can often hear in terms of terminology. I think there's bits for us as sports parents to understand in many ways it's good for us just to facilitate and keep putting our children in front of situations and allow it to evolve and work things out for themselves and actually just almost, I think, as Steve Magnus would describe, is just get them on the start line in many cases and just be a parent. I think expectations rise in sports parenting the moment our children potentially wear a kit that makes them look like mini adults, or somebody tells us that our children are quite good, or we suddenly have a really good performance that we then think, oh, well, this will happen again next week, or I'm going to see this now on a regular basis. And any coaches listening to this episode, I'll never forget this. And I held this view for about 20 years. I don't know where I got it from, but I always felt when I was coaching teams and groups that if they showed me a level of performance, I could expect that as a bare minimum every week because they'd shown me that they were capable of doing it. That means they were selling everybody short if they didn't hit those standards again. And I held on to this thoughts for years until I had Steve Magnus on the Parents in Sport podcast. And Steve's an amazing guy, works in performance, worked at the Nike Oregon project with Mo Farah and Alberto Salazar, really high performing runner. And he said, Gordon, but that's just bonkers if you think about it in the real world, because he said, surely then the world record would go every single week in all the events where we're measuring it. Because if we ran 151 last week, we're going to run 151 next week. Or if we swam 30 seconds in the pool, that means we can go under that because we're permanently getting better. And yet, actually, we got to the stage where we ended up talking about the reality of it is that your very best days in the perfect flow where the world is just brilliant are actually, sadly, not going to happen that often. But then you've also got to hope that your very worst days aren't going to happen that often as well. And actually, what you're looking to do is raise the middle. So instead of getting parents to talk to the kids about, always looking at the ceiling, actually, let's just raise the floor a little bit. What is a normal, level of performance? And the bits you were talking about there that you pulled from sport on general percentages, we've done the same as well. I think there was a period of time Harry Kane was scoring 1 in 4 shots. Mo Salah was dribbling the ball 8 times and losing it 4. Adam Lyth opened the batting for Yorkshire last year and I think got to 50 about 17% of his innings. So that's, again, 1 in 5, 1 in 6 chance of what might have been deemed a good performance by him. Got an England international who, in a period of a game recently, made 2 tackles out of 10. A success rate of 20%. We've got an All Black who's carried the ball 10 times in one game for a gain of 10 metres.
I had something similar. So I had something similar, and it was I like telling this story on expectations and setting those standards. I was on a training camp towards the back end of my career, and John Lewis, again, former teammate of mine, actually been on the show before. He's now the England women's head coach in cricket, and John is a legend of the game, absolute legend of the game. And he sat us down as a group of young bowlers, and he said, "Lads, how many wickets do you think I've taken?" And I think he's taken either just shy of 700 or 700 first-class wickets. He'd been around like a 20-year career, right? And he said, okay, out of those bunch of wickets that I've taken, how many fifers do you think I've taken? And we're like, oh, God, I don't know, John, like 80, 70, 80? And he said 35. And then when we broke it down, because those games that we're talking about are 2 innings games, right? So there's 2 innings. So you almost double the amount of times that he would be out there bowling. You would class a fifer as your day, like it's your day you've achieved. he said essentially 7% of the days that I went out onto the field were my day. So it was never about what you do with that 7% and trying to raise the 7%. It was about trying to manage the 93%. And those days where you just take one or two, you are bowling from an end and it's your job to be consistent and allow someone else to have their 7% day. And then it's just about getting by and then hopefully being in the team until bang, your 7% day turns up and you're like, right, it's my day. Everything's clicking. Everything feels good. And the problem is that and the same thing was, I then looked at the stats on batsmen, right? So some of the best batters, the top 10 batters that have ever lived and played the game, I think it's basically about 25% of test match conversions to hundreds. So that means 1 in 8 innings that they have, they will get 100. Now, those are the greatest players of the game ever. So if you're an athlete and say cricketer and you're going into a 15-game season and you're saying a great season for me would be to get 300-400s in this year, you're exceeding the stats of the best that have ever played. All right, it's not that level, but the point being is that you're setting an expectation of the level of performance you need to achieve in order to be happy and content with yourself that's potentially unrealistic.
Yeah, and I think we've got to be really careful how we frame that with our children. And I speak to some parents and young performers who end up doing some analysis. And I don't know if you've ever watched yourself on TV. I'm sure you have, but we always look 10 times worse than I think we play. You know, I think back, I used to watch videos and thought, God, I was really good and it looked like that. And it's like, oh my goodness, this doesn't look anything like what I'm watching on the TV. And we've got to be very careful with the youngest performers that we are not painting as, oh, well, it's going to look like that, because it isn't. And they're making these mistakes, and yet we don't seem to see it. Yet we can sit through analysis and say, and again, from a parenting point of view, sometimes as well, we miss some of the strengths. We miss some of the good bits, because all we're actually looking for is, what can we do better? What are the negatives? And maybe that's not helping either, because all we end up doing is zoning in on the things that are wrong. Now, yes, of course, there's going to be elements of that because we want people to improve and learn from it. But we've also got to be doing the other side as well, haven't we?
Mm. Yeah, and this comes down to what I was talking about, these MVPs, which are sort of the strategies I use for people to come out of this perfectionistic mindset when they're going into it, whether a practice or performance. So MVP can be a minimal viable practice or a minimal viable performance. And again, it's really worthwhile just taking a few moments, whether you're an athlete or a parent, to say, like, what am I kind of willing for them to accept here? Now, you have to frame this with the knowledge that sport is not really fair, and you never get perfect performance. You never get the elite performance every game. So if you only judge yourself based on the outcomes, you will forever be at the mercy of things that are totally out of your control. And if you're at the mercy of things that are out of your control, but then you want to try and control them, that is the pure definition of anxiety, stress, frustration, pressure, you name it. So the idea is to have as much in your control as you possibly can, to feel like you're confident, to feel like you can do what you want to do, to feel like you aren't setting potentially unrealistic expectations. So the minimal viable practice or minimal viable performance is going into the session and saying, what is the minimum standard of performance that I'm willing to accept here? So that could be, if I take that quarterback example, just a pass completion rate of 50% or 45%, right? And that's what I'm aiming for. If I achieve that, I know that that's a step in the right direction. You might increase that by 1% the next stage, next session. But also, it doesn't necessarily even have to be an outcome, right? It can be the minimal viable performance I'm going to have is the energy I'm going to bring to this game, is the character that I'm going to be here, what people are going to say about me after this performance. Because I don't know if today is going to be my day for outcome, but I can, if I control the things that I can control, I hope that I'm in the best possible frame of mind to turn that 93% day into a 7% day, right? Into a day where it potentially was going to be just a here or there performance to a great performance. Because again, we don't know how far off we are in a performance from it being a great day. But if we, again, and I think I use cricket again, and I'm sorry for constantly badgering on about cricket, but like there's so many batters I know that have ripped to themselves of the opportunity of a great performance because the beginning of their performance isn't at a standard at which they are happy with. They may not be at the right strike rate. They may not be going at a certain rate. And then they do something out of character. They do something out of process. And then they rip themselves of turning that into a great day because they've had some sort of perfectionistic idea of what the start of their innings should be. Whereas if they base it on, okay, well, the minimal viable performance I'm willing to accept here is my intent, my energy, the way in which I want to go about this, my character in that moment, I want to be brave. You then just keep pushing that performance down the road enough, and you're not judging it on outcome. Even if you get a first baller, even if you don't achieve the standard you wanted from an outcome point of view, you can put your head on the pillow at night going, I achieved what I said I was going to do, and I'm just going to go to the next performance and try it again, or I'm going to review what I've just done. Did it work? Did something distract me? And then we just go to the next one. And then hopefully, if I keep doing that, eventually a performance will come. But the problem is we focus so much on outcome and the standard, that side of things, that we rob ourselves of all the opportunities that are in front of us in the performances that could get there.
Yeah, and I think that sort of mental framework of things we can control, our actions, our character, things that are irrelevant of what's going on around us, we can switch back to is really important, isn't it? Rather than setting, I guess, performance goals that could go straight away. If we set an expectation, oh, well, I'm going to make, 8 passes out of 10 are going to be perfect, let's say. And in the first 10 minutes of the game, we've already made a mess of 4. As you say it, then what it means is it's like, oh, well, this is a disaster. And actually the performance becomes even worse. Whereas if we're saying, actually, I'm going to be brave, I'm going to be courageous, I'm going to fight for every moment, I'm going to bring this mindset to the table. You can switch that on all the time, can't you? Irrelevant of what's gone before.
Yeah. And as a parent, you can start to create those with your kids.
Yeah.
So you can start to set those out and say, right, what's our minimal viable performance that we're going to be happy with today? Removing outcome. So not outcome based performances or practices. And the reason I always I say a practice as well is sometimes we rob ourselves of a great practice because we set an unrealistic expectation of what our practice should be like. I don't fail in practice. I'm not willing to fail in practice. I gave a good example to a lad I was working with the other day. I'm showing him an example of my practice was I use when I'm batting, and I only use this for batting. I can use it for bowling as well. But when I start batting, I have the intent for the first 10 minutes to not get out, right? That's my sole goal. So I have to create an energy about myself to not get out, right? Capitalize on bad balls and hit aggressive shots, but it's not get out and waste that 10 minutes because I try to replicate what happens in a game, and I need to do that to practice. But then I had another moment sort of 10 minutes later where I shouted to my teammate and I said, right, I'm going to try something. And essentially that was me signaling to him, I'm about to fail and this is going to look ugly. This is about to look wrong. And I need to do this because I'm trying to explore something new. And so I do that. And then he knows, whether he knows or not, but it's just more for my sake, that I'm kind of giving myself permission to create some failures, but I'm doing it not tentatively. I'm doing it trying to explore this new part of my game that I want to work on. And then eventually I finish it with just sort of just being really hitting some check marks of the things that I do well to finish the session on a good note. I don't want to finish on a session where I've just failed all the time and I don't feel capable. But I would do that with my bowling as well. I would start the session as if I was starting a game to put myself on that pressure, to create a standard for myself that I want to try and achieve. I want to hit my most consistent ball as much as I possibly can and see where I'm at and practice my process. And then midway through, I might say, right, I'm going to practice a slower ball, a new thing. And that is, I need to announce that to either myself or those around me to go, I'm going to fail here. This is going to be messy. Sorry if this looks rubbish, if you want to apologize for it, but I need to fail in order to learn how to get it better and things like that. But sometimes we think in training, we need to be at such a high standard because we're being judged and we need to constantly do things perfectly that we rob ourselves of the opportunity to get better and grow. When actually the reality is it's a very simple conversation of just going, I'm about to try something new, see how this goes. This is me exploring, trying to get things right. Feel free to teach me, coach me through what you see. And that's why going into a practice session saying, what is the minimal viable performance I want to try and achieve in this practice, which is I'm going to go about it committed. If things go wrong, I'm going to stay on task and just accept that things are going to go wrong. Or today I'm going to be really detailed in my approach. Okay. It doesn't, again, none of those things give an outcome, say how well the session is going to go. It's just your approach to doing it. And if you as a parent can set that as well, when you have those conversations in the car or where you have those conversations at home, it's like, okay, well, today was a session where we said we were going to go into it committed, detailed, focused. Did you do those things?
Yeah.
Yes, no. If you didn't, what got in the way? How do we improve next time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really, valuable advice that we're sort of giving out there. Just moving on, just generally, let's just open this up slightly as we move into sort of the last part of the podcast. You're working with a lot of young people all around the world at the moment around their mental skills. I just love the authenticity and realism of your work, and probably that's hence why we get on pretty well off air. What are you seeing? What are you seeing in the teenagers, young people of today, in terms of how they're approaching their sport, some of the challenges that they're facing, and what would be, I guess, your final general advice to parents just around things that you're seeing, things that they might need to be aware of that are ultimately going to give our young people the best chance of fulfilling their potential both in and out of their sport?
Yeah, well, I did recently have a recorded episode with Dr. Julie Johnson from Nottingham Trent University, where we spoke about a paper she had done in swimming, and it was some strategies they'd come up with to working with specifically Gen Z athletes. And the majority of the people I work with are in Gen Z. Probably will eventually start to move into Gen Alpha. I think the next one is coming through. But we both concluded that we think they'll be very, very similar. We can't deny that young people are growing up in a digital age. So some of the things that they had found, and this was qualitative research that they'd done. So it was a lot of interviews with coaches and athletes. And the thing they'd come to know with, say, athletes, and I see this, so this is both from this conversation and then my experience, and I'm seeing that communication, social skills in person are a lot less than what they used to be. It's very hard to have those in-person conversations. It's undeniable that a technological age is creating a distracted mind. And that's why I found there is a thirst for, say, meditation through our Mind Strong Sport app. We've got athletes that are really wanting to understand, how do I remove these distractions? And then really a lot of what we've spoken about today stems from a lot of perfectionism, the expectations that they're putting on themselves, the world around them, what it's telling them. But there were also some really interesting things that did come out of, say, my conversation with Julie. Was they do know a lot about their sport. They're more highly knowledgeable about the sport themselves. So they know so much about it because of the information they're able to get. They know so much. But the challenge does become is you can know everything, but doing it and allowing that rubber to hit the road and then experiencing it, experiencing the failures. I know failure is something I need to go through, but geez, the experience sucks. And being able to deal with that and having the resilience to get back up and go again, or just go through a really challenging situation. I'm seeing a lot of athletes that do find that a struggle because, one, it's they self-identify as the failure as them being a failure. And then the distracted mind finds that there's opportunities they perhaps miss. So all of this, where we can look at the younger generation, and every generation kind of does it to the one below it, where they say, well, it was a lot harder in my day. But there are some things where in the world that Gen Z athletes and young people live in, it is complicated. It is really, really hard. It is very, very difficult to find out where you fit in this world right now. And sometimes your only job as a young person is to just figure out where the hell I fit in this world. And so it's really easy to take on things that perhaps put you down a path that you don't necessarily want to be going down. And I think the want to try and fit in with a lot of people, and this want to try and fit in with society and whatever silo that is, can rob you of your own authenticity of how you're going. And so you do see athletes that are not necessarily fully authentic in themselves because they're so worried about what other people are saying, this fear of other people's opinions of them. bit of FOPO, and you see it really, really damage them when things don't go well. So the emotional control is quite intense. So it's never been as intense as I've seen or even experienced when I was younger, just because there's so much coming at them. And so that creates a whole set of new challenges. And I think we have to be really open to how we are skilling ourselves in order to deal with it. So, for example, I knew that emotional control was something that was going to be really big for a lot of my athletes I work with. And me showing emotions was something that I struggled with growing up. I was quite stoic. It's how I've been brought up. It's my own parental upbringing. And that's just our family. And so I took on therapy in October last year. And I gave my therapist one goal. I said, I want you to be able to get me to a stage where I can portray my emotions in a far better way. And that's allowed me to connect with people better. I think it's come out in my podcast. I've felt more emotive in some of the stuff that I've done. I'm still work in progress, but also it's given me the ability to look after myself in that sense, so I can look after others, but also learn how I can do that for other people. And yeah, all of these issues that we see young people are facing, there is still one thing that I do say to them, and this is why I've branded a lot of my stuff Mind Strong, is that we've spoken about mental health for a long time in young people, and I think the conversation is great. However, if we only talk about something, we do them a disservice, whereas actually we want to make them mentally stronger. People feel by default better about themselves when they feel mentally stronger and capable of taking on challenges. And when we can do that, no matter how big or small that challenge is, we start to move in a direction where we become the character that we want. And that was pretty much how I built myself up as a young person. Was I defined the character I wanted to be, and then I just aimed at that and went towards it and made decisions really easy. And also on a larger scale, for young people right now, if the person next to you is pretty much got the same amount of anxiety and self-doubt as you have, which we know is pretty much true, what an opportunity that creates for you to jump above everyone else, to go and seek excellence, to get to that place. All you have to do is be willing to go through some really challenging times, be supported, the parents around them, try and support them in a way that doesn't connect their self-worth with outcome and the expectations that you're placing on them. Maybe look at reframing your own expectations, where of my own expectations, and hopefully this podcast and maybe some of the others around it that start to go, well, where are my expectations coming from? We can look within rather than just looking out. And then eventually that can hopefully get those athletes to a place where they are starting to be mentally stronger in themselves, and they're starting to achieve those aspirations that they want, because it just takes a little bit of work, and you will surprise yourself along the way, I'm sure.
Lewis, what an amazing way to finish the episode. Thank you for all you've shared, your honesty, your authenticity, as I've already mentioned, but also what you're seeing in the real world and the challenges that young people face. And I hope that our parents who are listening to this and coaches have gleaned something from today's episode. So Lewis, thank you for joining us.
Mate, absolute pleasure. Love it. Love the work that you're doing as well. So please don't stop. Keep it up.
Thanks, Lewis. So let's hopefully speak again soon.
Yeah, mate. Yeah, it was awesome. Yeah, good job.
Thank you for listening. Check us out at parentsinsport.co.uk.